Welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm your host, Richard Restuccia, and today we're going to be talking about landscape drip irrigation fittings and really the basics on this. And when I told a few people we were doing this, they were saying, really, Rich, we're going to talk about fittings? Does that really make a difference? And what I've actually found is that some of the biggest issues I see with irrigation systems, drip systems today, is matching the wrong fitting with the wrong tubing. And eventually this causes a big issue and really hurts the amount of water you're able to save as a water manager, a contractor, a homeowner. So taking us through this journey of fittings today is Andy Belingheri. Andy's the national sales manager for Jane Irrigation. Andy's got a long history in the landscape industry. He is a graduate from BYU, from the horticulture program there. He worked for Valleycrest, starting out as an account manager, managing crews in the field, moved up to a business developer, and started at Jane Irrigation a little over 7 years ago. Worked his way up to the national sales manager position. And one thing that is really interesting about Andy is not only does he know a lot about irrigation, but if you ever get a chance to talk to him about plants or landscapes in general, you'll really understand how much Andy knows about the landscape industry and all facets of it. So it's great to have somebody with this kind of knowledge and this kind of experience taking us through these basics. So Andy, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here as always. Thanks, Richard. And I appreciate the kind introduction.
Yeah. So Andy, I got to tell you, I'm just going to start this right off with really irrigation fittings. Do they really make that big of a difference?
They do, absolutely do. And I will show a couple examples of how they do make a difference, but it's more than, hey, you have a good tight fitting, and that prevents leaks, or that prevents tubing from blowing apart and prevents water waste. But it's also, it gets a little bit more complicated into the type of fitting, the size of fitting, and the size of tubing that goes along with that. And it's so fittings, I think, are often overlooked, but and I've got a picture that'll show that why that can be problematic if you don't understand the type of fitting you're using and the application, and how that not just makes I think of the landscape contractor that's going to spend more time having to make extra repairs, needless repairs, but also the waste of water when if those leaks and breaks aren't caught. I mean, how many gallons of water can run out? What that can do to your water bill, not to mention plant health and our desire to conserve water in general.
Yeah, you're so right, Andy. And everybody has their own story about the leak that happened next to the drain. So they didn't find it for 2 months after they got their water bill, and it was $30,000.
Yes. Yeah, that happens. That happens.
So here's the thing, though. You mentioned the tubing and all. Isn't all the tubing, isn't all half-inch tubing?
Yeah, well, hey, great, perfect segue here. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how that works here a little bit. As you can see here, we get just a quick, easy, basic review of some tubing that we have. And I'm pulling this from a previous webinar. We did a tubing basics webinar several months ago. If you want to go back and get the ins and outs of tubing, and there's another thing. People think all tubing is created equal, just like all fittings are created equal. It's not. There's different grades and quality, but I just wanted to do a quick refresh on tubing. We have small bore tubing. That's our 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch tubing. It's either made out of vinyl or polyethylene. And that's usually what we use to deliver water to the plants. And that is connected to our large bore tubing. I'm not going to go very deep on any of this. The large bore tubing is what's conveying the water from the valve, the source of our irrigation. Large bore tubing, generally speaking, is in 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and 1 inch, and it's always polyethylene. You won't, occasionally you'll see that in vinyl, but in the landscape usage, I would say it's almost 100% going to be polyethylene, maybe some indoor environments where you would see vinyl. And so those are the two basic types of fitting. So just to establish a baseline there. And if you want to know more about this tubing, like I said, go back and visit one of our previous webinars on tubing. So,
Andy, we have a quick question coming in about the tubing. Sorry to interrupt, but 1/8-inch tubing, do you see that much in the field? What do people use that for?
1/8-inch tubing, I see it occasionally in the landscape, not very often. Most of the time, 1/4-inch tubing is used in the landscape, and the reason is just because you can get more water through it without running into some of the friction loss and some of the flow restrictions. 1/8-inch tubing is going to be a lot more common in some agriculture greenhouse environments where they're going with a really slow flow, or where you don't need as much. Occasionally, I think it might work its way into landscape, but most common, when I say most common, 99.9% of the time, you're going to be using 1/4-inch tubing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for clearing that up. And I just want to remind everybody, we've got the chat and the Q&A open. So if you've got some questions or you want to make a comment, load them up in there and I'll ask them of Andy when appropriate. And as some of you may know, for good questions, we've been sending some great Jane Irrigation training t-shirts. So keep an eye out.
Oh, I want a t-shirt. I'm going to ask myself a good question here. So, all right. In order to identify the right tubing, in order to ID the right tubing, you need to have the right ID. And that's a little mnemonic, is that what it's called? A little play on words to help remember things. But OD and ID, why it matters. And of course, ID does not stand for identification. In this instance, it stands for inside diameter. And of course, OD stands for outside diameter. And we have to understand both the ID and the OD in order to select the right fitting. And ID and OD is measured in inches. Of course, ID is simple. It's the outside diameter. You can see in the diagram here in the bottom right of the screen. It is the outside. If you were to take a caliper and measure the outside of the tubing, you would get the outside diameter. And of course, you could do the same thing with the inside diameter or the ID. And this becomes key to measuring or to key measurement to understand how and which fitting to use. So with that in mind too is another kind of basic one to establish. Now, this is where things start to get a little complex. And if you go back and you look at that training that we did on tubing several months ago, my format here is when I switched computers got off a little bit. I apologize. Those were supposed to be all lined up. But with 1/8-inch tubing, that's pretty simple. That's a 0.187 inch by a 0.125 inch outside diameter by inside diameter. So 1/8-inch tubing is really a 1/8-inch inside diameter tubing. 1/4-inch, which is a lot more frequent, there's actually two sizes of 1/4-inch. There's a 0.220 by 0.160 or a 220 by 160, and there's a 250 by 170. So now we're going from an 1/8-inch inside diameter on that tubing to now a 1/4-inch outside diameter on this tubing, which is it's all fine, and it'll make sense when you understand those fittings and the way they work. But where it really starts to get complicated here is when we get into 1/2-inch tubing. Now, this is the biggest frustration I think that I have. I'm sure a lot of people have. If it's called 1/2-inch tubing, why is it not all 1/2-inch? There's at least 4 different sizes of what we call 1/2-inch tubing, and I'm aware of a 5th size as well. Okay, so we have this first size of 1/2-inch tubing, the 620 by 520, also referred to 16 millimeter. That's going to be the smallest of the 1/2-inch sizes. Again, that's a 0.62 outside diameter by a 0.52 inside diameter, measured in inches. Moving up from there, we have a 0.660 by 0.560 or 17 millimeter. And that's going to be the brown tubing you see, typically that brown drip tubing. Now, just because it's drip tubing doesn't mean it's 17 millimeters. So you always got to look at the size of your tubing to know what you're working with. These are the common sizes. And then we move to, this must have come from the United States because there's no metric measurement for it whatsoever. That's 700/600, which is really 5/8 of an inch, but we call it 1/2 inch. And if you're not confused yet, well, I'm really trying hard to to show you how confusing this is. But that 0.7 inch by 0.6 inch, this is going to be the most common tubing you see in the landscape. Most markets I'm aware of where they're selling 1/2 inch strip tubing, it's typically going to be this what we call 700, 600. And moving up from there in size, we have our 710, 620, which is metrically, that's an 18 millimeter.
So Andy, we have a quick question coming in, and that is, okay, so I know how I can measure the outside diameter of my tubing, but do I really need a micrometer? What do I need to measure the inside, or where do I find out what that number is?
Yeah, so you could get, I've got a caliper at home that you can measure things outside or inside. You don't even need that. If you have the packaging of the tubing, it'll say on there what the ID and OD is. Now that's great when you're installing something new and it's labeled. If you don't, we'll talk about that. If you don't know what size tubing you have, a couple little tricks for you. But typically, either in the catalog from the manufacturer, it'll list the size of the tubing, or on the packaging of the tubing itself, it'll list the size of the tubing. And these are important things to know when you're doing installation.
You know what would be really great, Andy?
What's that?
We had one fitting that just fit all those 1/2 inch tubing sizes.
Yeah. Well, there you're starting to give away some of my secrets. That's one of the tricks. That's one of the tricks that we'll talk about here. One of the things that Jane does well, especially in our fitting category, but we do it with our tubing, we do it with our filters, we do it with our emission devices, but specifically with fittings, we can take something complex and make it simple. And if you're a landscape contractor, what that means is reduce labor. Complex to simple means reduction in labor, reduction in labor force. So we'll talk about what that is specifically. You can see a 3/4 inch tubing. There's 2 sizes, and then 1 inch tubing. There's several sizes of 1 inch tubing as well, but they all fit within that, 1.2 by 1.06 or 1200 by 1060, as it's called. Okay. So as you can see, things just aren't simple. I buy a 1/2 inch fitting, I get, if I buy a 1/2 inch tubing, I get 1/2 inch fitting. That's not the way it works, right? So you can see things start to get a little bit complicated. And so really, to your original question, does it matter? Well, yeah, it matters, because if I had the wrong size fitting, you're going to end up with problems. So, but the question that came up earlier, how do I know? How can I figure out what I have? You'll see this on manufacturer specifications. This chart I've got here, this happens to be from Jane. You can see this in catalogs. You can see it in websites. You can see the as you're ordering tubing or part numbers, whatever your tubing. You can look up a chart and figure out exactly what you had based on either part number or so forth, and you can get that size, and you can figure out which fitting you need. So that's another little help there. So now that we've got that established, I want to talk about some fittings in general, right? And you can see there's a myriad of different fittings here on the screen, and we'll talk about each one of these and the pros and cons, and maybe what you should look out for, and so some tips and tricks to make your life a lot easier. And the hint is the fitting on the left there. So first thing I want to talk about, remember we introduced 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch tubing. That's our spaghetti tubing. I've always called it spaghetti tubing, but it's what delivers the water from your distribution tubing, your 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch tubing out to the plant. And they are always connected with a barb fitting. You can see an example of a barb fitting in the lower left there. It's a simple barb. The fitting goes into the tubing. Therefore, ID matters. So I'm not aware of a fitting that doesn't fit both sizes of 1/4 inch tubing, but you always want to double check and make sure that the size range of the fitting corresponds with the inside diameter of the tubing. And that's a simple thing to look up. But like I said, I've never seen one that doesn't fit both sizes. And there's several of these configurations that are available. They're very inexpensive. They're very straightforward to use. I won't say easy to use, because once you've done several of these, your hands really start to hurt. These things, they're small, a lot of sharp angles, and it really creates a lot of stress. And one thing I recommend is an insertion tool. You can use it's like a clamp style insertion tool. It inserts the tubing right into the emitter, and that makes it great. And you can see we got a few different other tools there. It comes right out of our catalog. The blue, red, and yellow all happen to be punch tools. And what you would use those for, so imagine, let's pretend this is a coupling and not a T. I could attach my 1/4-inch tubing to this side, punch a hole in my 1/2-inch tubing, and then insert this right into the 1/2-inch tubing. And I'll show you a diagram of it right here. And this diagram comes courtesy of our friends over at Drip Depot. And so you can see I have my 1/4-inch tubing, and I've got my 1/4-inch connector, and I've got my 1/2-inch tubing. I can poke a hole in the tubing, put the connector in, and then insert the tubing over that, and I'm able to run water from my distribution line to my plant. So it becomes a great way to get water moving over there. Now,
yeah, I'm so happy you showed those tools, Andy, because, you know, connecting one, not a big deal. But if you're at this for a few hours or putting in a new system, boy, that can really make a difference.
it does. It does. One thing to watch out for. Now, these connectors are not foolproof. And what can happen if you get sloppy on creating the hole, and you can create a scenario where the hole's almost too big for that connector, that barbed connector, and water starts to leak out, water starts to spray out. So you want to make sure you got a good sharp punch, hole punch. I mean, those things are cheap enough. You should replace them often. A good clean hole with a nice tight fitting on that 1/4-inch connector. If not, you'll end up with water blowing out the side, which is never a good thing. And again, just as a reminder to everybody, these are designed to work in low pressure systems. So if you're exceeding 50 psi, you're going to have problems as well. So
yeah, great point, Andy. So another question coming in, and this person's asking, really, with the 1/4-inch tubing, I'm not really going to buy the wrong fitting.
Correct. If you have 1/4-inch tubing and you have a 1/4-inch fitting, you will be safe. You may find that the smaller size 1/4-inch tubing is a little bit harder to get over the fitting, but when you look at the size chart for those fittings, it covers the inside diameter range of both the 160 and the 120.
Yeah. Okay. Very nice. Thank you.
170. Sorry, 160 and 170. So now we get into 1/2-inch. Remember how un-1/2-inch 1/2-inch is, right? the great misnomer, 1/2-inch. One of the more common fittings you see in 1/2-inches is barbed fitting. Now, they do make these in 16 millimeter. They're not as common, but 17 millimeter is very common. And this style fitting, it's similar to the 1/4-inch fitting. It's got barbs on it. The fitting itself inserts into the tubing. So ID matters. Again, inside diameter matters. The great thing about these fittings is they are very cheap. One of the downsides, though, is they only work on one specific size tubing. So for example, this picture I have in the lower left, it's got a 17 on it. And it has a 17 on it because it only works on 17 millimeter tubing. If you tried to use this fitting on 700 by 600 tubing, it would go in great. And as soon as you pressurize the system, it's going to blow apart. So you want to make sure that you've got the right size. Now, the industry for the most part has made it easy. Most of the time, 17 millimeter tubing is brown, and the 17 millimeter fittings are brown. So that makes it real easy. So if I'm doing a brand new installation, I buy all 17 millimeter tubing. It's really easy to get all 17 millimeter fittings, and I don't have to worry about things getting mixed up. So that becomes easy. Or if I'm doing a repair and I see brown tubing, I can put with confidence a 17 millimeter barbed fitting back on there, and it will be the right size. However, now there's some other downsides with these barbed insert fittings. besides the fact that they only work on one size. As you can see in this picture in the lower right, they come apart, and these things are known to blow apart, either through it gets warm, the tubing starts to get soft. If you have a lower grade tubing, it gets soft a little bit, it gets warm outside, it loosens up, your pressure is too high, it can blow apart. Or if you put that fitting on a couple times, maybe it starts to get worn out a little bit around that tubing, and it just doesn't hold as well, and so it blows apart. And you can see that was an example of that here in this picture in the lower right. Now, I've known guys to come back with hose clamps and put hose clamps on over those to install them. I know other manufacturers that sell with their fitting metal clamps and then a special tool to install the metal clamp. There is a much better way, and I'll keep on teasing this out. There is a much better way to do this, but when it comes to bar insert fittings, this is the lowest quality, but also the lowest cost that's out there. You're on a budget, hey, maybe it's the way to go, but it comes at another expense. So low cost, low quality.
Yeah, it's interesting, Andy, because as I think about this, I think a lot of drip irrigations happening at early in the morning when no one's around to see if there's a problem. You've got a 1/2 inch or 17 millimeter tubing here at let's say 30, 25 pounds of pressure. Typically the drip irrigation is scheduled, 45 minutes, hour, 30 minutes. It's going to flow for a long time and nobody's going to see it. It's kind of scary.
Yeah. I worked with a guy many years ago where a customer called in and said, hey, look, we got a bunch of drip irrigation things. You got fountains spraying all over in the middle of the day. And he's like, oh, we'll be right out in there to fix it. He sent a guy out, and 30 minutes later it was fixed. And I said, well, that was quick. How do you fix it so fast? He's like, oh, we didn't fix it. We just set the clock to run in the middle of the night so nobody sees it.
Right. Oh boy.
That is not the way to do it. Don't be like that guy.
Yeah, it's a great story, Andy.
All right. So moving up in our quality and also cost, we have compression fittings. Now with a compression fitting, the tubing goes, rather than the fitting going inside the tubing goes inside the fitting. So this is where OD, or outside diameter, becomes critical. Now, we mentioned before there's 4 different sizes of 1/2 inch tubing. Each one has a different outside diameter. And you can see in these 3 examples I have on the bottom, I didn't get a picture of the fourth, that fourth one, the gray one's for 3/4 inch, but you see green, black, and blue. There's also a 4th color, yellow. If you've ever wondered why those fittings have a different color rings on them, it's because each one corresponds to a different size fitting. Green would be the 16 millimeters. You can see here, that black is 700, 600. Blue is 18 millimeter, or 710, 620. So each color corresponds to a different size tubing. The problem, and these fittings, they for the most part, they work well. Once the tubing goes in, it doesn't come back out. Once it goes in, over time, it can begin to leak. And they are, when tubing is extruded, there's some tolerances in the outside diameter size, but there is no tolerance whatsoever on these rings and these compression fittings. So sometimes you get tubing that's made really well and it goes in well. Other times it is a beast to get in. It can be really, really challenging. I've seen tubing kink and bend and tear before it actually goes into these compression fittings. But the cost is reasonable. And if you have a quality tubing and quality fitting, this can be a decent solution as well. The biggest problem with this fitting is, okay, so let's say I have a green and a yellow and a black and a blue, all those fittings I carry on my truck, right? I'm carrying four fittings for each size I could potentially encounter. And if I'm going out to make a repair in the field and I see some black tubing in the ground, how do I know what size it is, right? I don't. It becomes a guessing game. I pull out the green one, that one, there's no way. Black one, that's kind of a tight fit. I really don't want to try too hard to get it on. I'm gonna go with blue. Blue goes on nice and easy. It slips right on. but maybe it's the wrong size and you bury it up and then it blows apart and you're out there tomorrow making the repair for free. So it just becomes very, very complicated to know what size tubing you have for that particular fitting. Again, if you had a brand new install where everything was 700, 600 tubing and every fitting was that black ring, that's not going to be a problem. But in a repair environment, or if you don't know the size of the tubing, or if you're dealing with a low quality tubing where you get some variation in the consistency of the outside diameter, it becomes a problem. It means it costs you more time, and time means money. And with labor being the single largest direct expense facing landscape contractors, that's if you can find the labor to begin with right now. But when labor is the single largest direct expense, anything you can do to save time and save money becomes critical to the success of your business, not to mention the quality of your install.
Yeah, so Andy, if I'm a landscape maintenance contractor, I've just taken over a new job, I've got a break, or I need to change a fitting, how would I even figure out what size tubing I had?
So that's the thing, is that if it's brown, a really good chance at 17 millimeter. Yeah. If it's black tubing, it could be 16 millimeter, it could be 18 millimeter, it could be 700, 600. There's really no way to know. You could carry a caliper with you, but has the tubing been compressed and you get a bad measurement? I mean, there's a way to do it and get it right, but at a much larger expense. And here is, and I'll show you a way now to do it and not have to worry about any of this. And that is the Power-Loc fitting, multi-diameter. And so as we move up this scale from low cost and low quality to medium, this becomes now the higher cost, but much higher quality fitting. And this multi-diameter Power-Loc fitting will fit everything between 16 and 18 millimeter tubing. So all 4 sizes of 1/2-inch tubing, and really there's a 5th out there as well, a 705 by 605. This fitting fits all of those. So go back to that scenario before where I had to have a green and a yellow and a black and a blue fitting on my truck. All that redundancy, I no longer need that. I can carry 1 coupling instead of 4, 1 T instead of 4. And the beauty of this Power-Loc fitting doesn't end there. It's not just the fact that it's a one size fits all. It also locks onto the tubing. So this, and I'll show you here in this diagram, you can see in step 1, the tubing goes over a barb on the fitting, much like a barbed insert fitting. So that tubing goes over the barb goes inside the tubing. But then rather than having to use a clamp and a special tool at an additional expense, we've got this locking barrel, this locking nut that screws back over the tubing, locks the tubing onto the barb on that Power-Loc fitting, locks it into place with power. And imagine that, it's a Power-Loc fitting. And it holds it there. The tubing will blow apart before the fitting comes undone. And this drip tubing is rated for about 55 psi. So, or your drip system shouldn't exceed 55 psi. So as long as you're within that operating pressure, you'll be fine. But let's say you cut your tubing the wrong size, you can back that locking nut off, pull the tubing off, cut it to the right size, and then reinstall it so it's reusable. And even if that outside of the tubing becomes stretched, you still have that locking barrel to go down over the top of it to keep it in place. So these Power-Loc fittings, while they may cost a few cents more, you more than make up for it in time.
Yeah, Andy, as a gardener, as a contractor, I have so many things to worry about, right? Are my plants getting the right amount of water? When did I fertilize? What about those weeds? All these things, the last thing I want to be worried about is my fittings popping off and wasting a lot of water.
Yeah. Had a guy I know in Vegas was working on a property. I called him up one day. What are you doing? He's like, I got these fittings are blown off. I got a bunch of hose clamps. I'm running out to install hose clamps all day. And I gave him a bag of this was, probably 6-7 years ago. I gave him a bag of Power-Loc fittings, and he said, "This is the best kept secret. Where have these things been?" And it really is. You spend an extra 20 cents in material and you save $5 in labor. And that's not counting the return trips, that factor in as well. Power-Loc fitting is great. And the other thing too, there's a few locking fittings on the market. This Power-Loc fitting is the only one that fits the one size fits all fitting. There are other fittings out there, they're not one size fits all, but there's an added benefit to this style fitting. It's very ergonomic. When you get it in your hand, it just feels good. And when you're installing hundreds of these a day, it's less wear and tear on your hands. And the arthritis and carpal tunnel, the other thing that use your hands all day, just that strain and wear and tear and cramping that happens. Because this is an ergonomic fitting, it's a lot easier to use. You'll see some out there that have these big wings on them, and they're just a pain. They hurt your hands. Both barbs have to spin in the same direction, which isn't right. They should spin in opposite directions so you could twist them on. There's really a lot of thought and a lot of engineering that went into this fitting. And for gardeners that maybe are arthritic or have problems, weaknesses with their hands, this is a great way to solve that problem. It's a very easy fitting to use, ergonomic, but it also holds on and it's not going to blow off. So you have that peace of mind as well. And I really can't say enough good things about these Power-Loc fittings.
Yeah, Andy, we got a couple of questions coming in. One wants a clarification. So when you do the Power-Locs, they spin opposite, like you're squeezing a towel, wringing out a towel?
Correct. On a coupling. Yeah. Yep.
So, okay. And then this person just wants to be sure they heard you right. The Power-Loc fitting will fit 3 sizes of the 1/2-inch tubing, right?
4 sizes, everything between 16 millimeter and 18 millimeter. And most commonly, there's going to be 4 sizes: 16, 17, 700, 600, and 800, or 18 millimeter. And there's also 705, 605 is right in between 700, 600, and 18 millimeter. That's not very common. That's more of a spec thing. But everything in the 1/2-inch family, this Power-Loc fitting, the PL55 is kind of the internal jingo we use at Jane, but that PL55 fits everything in the 1/2-inch family.
Wow, so much easier because I could buy somebody else's Power-Loc, but I'm going to, again, have to know the tubing that it goes on. But the Jane fits it all. Great.
Fits it all, yeah, exactly. So, I just wanted to kind of wrap up with this. This was, my backyard. Insert fittings blew apart, replaced it with the Power-Loc. My Power-Loc fittings, they don't leak. They don't come apart. Compression fittings over time, they leak. Insert fittings over time, they'll blow apart, but the Power-Loc is the solution. New installation, never worry about again. Maintenance, quick and easy installation. It really is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm so happy you said that about the leaks too, because I think a lot of people think, sometimes I think, oh, well, a little leak there, it's just another emitter. It's just another way to add some water to my root zone. But what I really find is when I have a little leak at every fitting, this is where the weeds grow. And I'm pulling the weeds next to the leak. And I'm like, I'm defeating the purpose of my drip.
Well, we use drip irrigation. Well, most of us anyway. Maybe we inherited it, but the purpose of drip irrigation is twofold. Number one, great for plant health, but number two, more importantly, we're using less water to maintain that plant health. I look at the news in Southern California, can only water 1 day a week. I look at the news in Las Vegas, grass is being outlawed, right? Non-functional turf. Where water conservation, I think, will continue to take more and more of a center stage in our society. Let's a fitting blowing apart and you're running this system for 60 minutes. Let's say it's only 3 times a week. It's not running every day, but that's a lot of water flowing through that system over 60 minutes that's coming out of there. That's wasted. Increased water bills and the waste. So fittings can play a critical role in keeping your irrigation system healthy. Not to mention that you look at this picture on the left, all the plants that are depending on that water after that break, they're not getting anything. And so I'm not just wasting water, but now I got the expense of having to replace plant material. So it's it's complex in its importance.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that about Southern California too, Andy, because I really think it's the way that the nation's going to eventually go. And one thing I thought was interesting, I taught a water management class at the Water Conservation Garden in San Diego over the weekend, and I had 3 homeowners. Now we get our bills every other month here in San Diego. I had 3 homeowners tell me that their water bill, so 2-month water bill, but 3 homeowners, their water bill more than $1,500. And man, they wanted to know what they could do about that. And the reality is it's going up. It's going to get more expensive. So they're going to have to figure out how to use less. We talked a lot about that and we helped them, but this is unbelievable. $1,500 water bill. And it wasn't just like one outlier. It was three people.
Well, yeah, if you can, anything you can do to reduce that, that'd be huge.
Yeah.
Real money.
Can I play my dad a second? That's more than my first mortgage.
So, last thing, just closing thoughts here. There's a variety of different fittings out there. Of course, you see a Power-Loc fitting. I've been showing couplings and tees and elbows, but there are flush valves that have these fitting. There are end caps that have these different types of fittings. So it's not just as you're teeing off or bending a corner or connecting 2 pipes together. It's the end of the line. It's your air relief in the middle. These are all the places where you could have you're connecting tubing to other type of hardware. At the beginning of the line, when you're connecting your tubing to your pressure regulator as well, you got those fittings there as well. So just to keep that in mind as you're considering your drip irrigation system. It's not just tees and elbows and couplings. And that was what I had prepared for today.
Yeah, well, that was a great job, Andy. I know we talked earlier and we said, what's going to be a success in this webinar? And the measure was, can you make irrigation fittings interesting? And you definitely succeeded. This was fascinating. I learned more about fittings than I knew before, that's for sure. And it's certainly going to make me a better gardener, a better water manager as a result. So thanks for coming on and helping us out today.
My pleasure.
I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. Really appreciate you giving a little bit of your day to us to improve your water management, your understanding of irrigation. Remember, you can see all our trainings at the Jane Irrigation, janesusa.com website /trainings is where you'll find all of those. It's almost 200 of them on there now, from everything from fittings to cloud computing for your irrigation scheduling. So there's a lot there. Check it out. It's also wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're dark on Friday due to the Memorial Day weekend. So we hope everybody has a really nice long weekend, and we'll talk to you after that. Andy, again, thanks very much. Great job today. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Happy Memorial Day.